Facebook Live with the Independent Women's Forum. I'm Ericka Andersen. Today I'm joined by Romina Boccia, an economic expert from the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us, Romina.
Thank you for having me.
And I should also mention that you used to work at the Independent Women's Forum as well, so we're glad to be speaking with you again, bringing you back.
It's my pleasure to be on with you. The Independent Women's Forum has a very special place in my heart.
So when it comes to nearly every political issue, there's confusion in the media about what's actually true and what's not. And it's no different when it comes to the latest tax plan proposed by President Trump. The president recently spoke at the Heritage Foundation about his plan, making the point that we've seen very few changes that help Americans since the 80s. Let's clear up a few things though, Romina. When we look at the Trump administration's plans for tax reform, you have the typical naysayers spouting that it will only benefit the rich. Do you see this as being true, and what are the misperceptions that you see being pushed in the media?
I think there are two key misperceptions. One is about the corporate rate cut, who actually currently pays the corporate rate and who will benefit from a rate reduction. And the other one is this idea that the rich should pay their fair share, but it's very general. And nobody can really tell you what that fair share is. People have ideas, but when you actually look at the data, it doesn't pan out that way. So let me just briefly address both of those. What we know about corporate taxes is that although they are collected at the corporate level from the corporation, the costs of the corporate tax is actually not borne by the corporation. We have now over a decade's worth of economic research looking at the historical record and comparing different countries who've reduced their corporate rates and who ended up benefiting from those rate reductions. And it is absolutely clear that it's workers who both bear the burden of the corporate rate, of the corporate tax, and who end up benefiting the most from a corporate rate reduction. And the reason for that is that corporations can locate all around the globe in a variety of different jurisdictions. And when a country has a much higher corporate tax rate than other countries, this is the case for the US today, our corporate rate is about twice what the average global corporate rate is, then corporations will locate in lower tax jurisdictions, which means fewer corporations in America than would otherwise be the case if we had a more competitive rate, and that directly translates into demand for workers and investments in the kinds of productivity-enhancing technologies that make workers more productive, which allows them to demand higher wages. So when we cut the corporate rate, by bringing in more businesses to the United States, we raise competition and demand for workers, and we also have more investments in workers, all of which drive up wages for workers.
Right.
So that is the first misconception.
I know you were on CNBC recently talking about this very thing, and I think that's definitely a misperception that people don't realize that the higher the corporate tax rate, the lower the wages they're going to be able to pay their workers. And so, if people really were to understand this in full, they would want to lower the corporate tax rate in order to help themselves and to help those workers that will in turn be able to make higher wages because of it. I think that's a huge misperception. Definitely want to clear that up. There's something else to address as well. Some say it's problematic to cut taxes because it creates a wider budget deficit. Where would you say they're right or wrong on that point?
So if I can just come back quickly to the one more other point is,
Sure.
Will tax reform benefit mostly the wealthy? If you look at the current income tax code, 70% of federal income taxes are borne by the top 10% of earners. And the bottom 50% of income earners only bear 3% of the federal income tax burden. So there's practically no mathematical way not to benefit the top 50% of income earners because they pay 97% of all the federal income taxes. So that's where if you're actually doing tax reform, and you're talking about the federal income tax, you can't get around affecting the tax burden of middle and upper income earners because they bear pretty much all of the tax burden. Other folks still have to pay payroll taxes, and their state and local taxes as well as property taxes. So it's not true that the other Americans don't pay any taxes. Their federal income tax liability is much lower. But on this question of the deficit, we have to remember that it is spending that is driving the growth in the debt. And we actually now collect more tax revenue than we have in the history of the United States, and tax revenues are projected to go up. This is before this tax cut that the president is talking about would take place. What the problem we have is that spending is far outpacing the growth in tax revenue. So spending is growing at a much, much higher rate, and it will continue to do so indefinitely until lawmakers in Congress put in place fiscal controls that control especially entitlement spending, because 85% of the growth in spending over just the next 10 years comes from healthcare, Social Security, and interest on the debt. And if you're looking even further than 10 years, 100% of the growth in the budget, of the growth in spending, will result from entitlement programs. So we need entitlement reform. Now, when we cut taxes and that lowers revenues for the government, right now it's not clear just how much lower revenues will be. The Senate is talking about making room for a $1.5 trillion tax cut in the budget. But you have to keep in mind future projections of tax revenue are so volatile. They depend very greatly on the size of the economy and growth in the economy, much more than on tax rates. So when tax reform takes place and economic growth takes off, as well with the president's regulatory reforms, we have two forces pushing in the right direction for more economic growth. We may find that the tax cut ends up costing a lot less than economists are currently projecting.
When it comes to entitlement reform, I know that you guys do a ton of work on that over at the Heritage Foundation. Where do you see the priorities lying there? Where should we be prioritizing the entitlement reform, and how can we do so in a way that you're not getting pushback from the left that says you're, hurting people at the same time?
So I think there are two approaches you can take. One is look at the biggest programs that are growing the fastest. So you're really addressing the root cause of growing spending in that debt, and that's clearly healthcare programs. Currently, Medicaid is growing fastest, and that has to do with the Medicaid expansion that was part of Obamacare. And then Medicare is growing in the long run even faster, and that has to do with the aging of society and the fact that these programs are very outdated, and they target much broader populations that make sense and then we can afford. The other approach would be to say, okay, we tried health care. Congress sort of burned itself on trying to repeal Obamacare. Let's go for a politically different target and see if we can make some progress there. And that is where the president is talking about welfare reform. He's already laying the groundwork for it. And as part of that, we can also look at the Social Security Disability Insurance Program and the Supplemental Security Income Program. Those are part of Social Security and have been some of the fastest growing programs as more and more individuals are using them either as a long-term unemployment program or an early retirement program. So welfare and disability reform looks like they will be on the horizon next. But we also need to tackle the big programs, and that really is Medicare and Social Security. They already consume 40% of the entire federal budget, and they're growing to consume more than half of the budget in just about 20 years. So those programs, the best changes to make are introducing more market forces, especially in healthcare, through premium support in Medicare, allowing seniors to stay on their employer plans after they turn 65 if they like to do so, or choosing from other private healthcare plans, getting the government out of the business of being a massive health insurer. Our largest improper payment rates, if you're talking about government waste, come from these healthcare programs. So to the extent that we can get government out of the way and get more choice toward consumers, that will go a long way. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office shows that premium support, giving consumers more control over their healthcare dollars, is expected to reduce costs for taxpayers and beneficiaries, in this case, in Medicare's case, seniors, because they also have to pay a portion of their premiums right now. So when healthcare costs go down, their premiums will be lower as well.
It does seem like sometimes when you're hearing from politicians on the left that it almost seems that they believe that the United States has an endless pool of money from which to pull. And I know I've seen some of the charts that you guys have done over at Heritage, showcasing the forecast of what's going to happen to the debt and the deficit as time goes on. Is it, you're saying it's possible to rein it in. What happens if we don't? What happens if, say, the next president is not interested in tax reform and somehow people are not pulling in these entitlement reforms? What happens if we don't rein it in?
So right now, the U.S. national debt is already larger than what the entire U.S. economy produced in all measured goods and services, GDP, last year. Our national debt, it is such a huge number that it's easy for people to lose sight of what it really means. But what it means is if you're like most people, you'll care about financial independence. That means the ability for you to provide for yourself and for your family securely. And you'll also care about economic opportunity. The ability to be able to get a new job or earn a raise or perhaps start your own business and become independently employed. All of those depend on a strong economy, and that depends on getting our fiscal house in order. What we know when countries take on too much debt is that it drags down economic growth, because investors that are looking to invest in the United States, they begin worrying about higher taxes in the future. Ultimately, deficits and debt are just delayed taxation. Eventually, those funds have to be paid down. The other problem is that you really have a moral problem. The current generation is consuming more resources because we are borrowing so much money. That means that there are fewer resources available for the younger generation, and many of whom, newborns, for example, don't even have a say over how the budget is allocated. So it's fundamentally unfair that we are spending our children's future today. Now, if we were making investments that will benefit us in the future, perhaps there could be some justification, or if we're addressing a major crisis, like we had a huge debt run-up during World War II, those are justifiable reasons. But right now we're borrowing for the purpose of consumption, primarily because of benefit programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and while there are certainly individuals that rely on those benefits that truly need them, we need to reform these programs to make sure that they're better targeted towards those populations, and we only borrow for justified purposes and not because it's easy to do. And one of the critical components for the U.S. is the strength of the U.S. dollar, which is directly tied in with investor confidence in the U.S. being able to repay its debts. And that confidence is also projected to go down, which could lead to higher interest payments as our debt continues to grow and the U.S. fails to put a credible fiscal plan in place that signals that we are getting our fiscal house in order and we are on a path to balance the budget. That's where we need to be. Unfortunately, lawmakers don't tend to act on the debt unless the public really demands it. We saw this energy in 2011. Currently, people aren't as worried about the debt, but as the deficit is now growing again and as interest costs are projected to rise, I think we'll see more public interest in the debt, and then lawmakers will act to reduce some of the risks that we're currently facing.
Yeah, it definitely seems like the debt and deficit issues kind of took a back seat to some of the cultural issues that have been popping up in the past couple of years. I wanted to quickly go back to something you said earlier because I think this is important to address. You mentioned how much a percentage the high earners are paying in federal taxes, and the argument that you constantly hear from the left is the rich need to pay their fair share, and that phrase really sticks out to people, and it really hits home with the public. Can you kind of address that phrase and how it's actually a little bit misleading in how they present it?
So it's when you look at some polls where people have been asked, what do you think is a fair share for the rich to pay? Oftentimes people think that the rich should pay a higher proportion of their income than do middle class or lower income people, but they usually will circle in around somewhere around 40%, that perhaps the top 10% should bear 40% of the tax burden. They have no idea exactly what share of the federal tax burden is currently borne by the top 10%. And when you point out to them that it's actually already 70%, they're taken aback. The fact that the top 10% of earners bear 70% of all income taxes makes the United States one of the most progressive nations in the world. In most other countries, including in Europe and Canada, middle-class individuals bear more of the tax burden because they have a different tax structure, including the value-added taxes, for example, which is a national sales tax. The U.S. doesn't currently have that, so the income tax is very much skewed toward wealthier earners. Now, there are certainly some individuals and companies that have made good use of lawyers to figure out how to lower that very excessive tax burden. But by simplifying our tax code through tax reform, we can make it fair for all Americans. However, it looks like the president's plan would actually reduce the tax burden for lower income and middle class Americans even more than it's already the case. So it could be that even fewer Americans will bear any federal income tax burden at all. Some people might find that concerning because we want everyone to have a stake in our government and to have a better understanding for how much spending really costs. If a majority of Americans don't have to share in that cost, what we might end up with is more demand for government spending and programs because the cost of those is borne by somebody else.
Right, and you just mentioned simplifying the tax code, which, as you've mentioned, and we've reported that hasn't been done since 1986. And we also calculated at IWF that people spend 27 hours at least preparing their taxes every year. So this is really something that I feel like bipartisanly people should be getting behind because everybody hates to do their taxes. And when they do their taxes, they're always just kind of crossing their fingers, hoping that they did it right for the most part. So I think that is such an important point. Do you think that it's actually gonna happen? Are we gonna be able to finally simplify the tax code?
Simplification is one of the primary goals of this tax reform effort. Pro-growth reforms are critical here. In terms of simplification details, what we're currently looking at is an expanded standard deduction, potentially a doubling of the standard deduction. What that would mean is that many taxpayers wouldn't face any income tax liability on a certain portion of their income. Right now, about 3 out of 10 taxpayers have to itemize, and that is where a lot of the tax administrative burden comes from, having to keep track of things like your mortgage interest deduction and expenses if you're running a business, and all sorts of different credits that you might be eligible for. With a broader standard deduction, 95% of Americans filing their taxes would no longer have to itemize at all. The standard deduction would take care of all of their current deductions and tax credits. But there are some special interest pressures to bring certain deductions and credits, they say, above the line. Basically, they want them to apply even after the standard deduction has already been taken. But that's really just how the sausage, unfortunately, is made in Washington. Many of those aren't good economic policies, but in order sometimes to get a bill done in the Congress, you have to make concessions to some of the most powerful interest groups. You can just see how difficult it is to drain the swamp. But doubling the standard deduction should help most taxpayers reduce their burden. And the other key thing for businesses in particular will be allowing for full expensing. So instead of when you buy a computer, only being able to write off 50% and then having to track track the remainder and deduct it over a period of, say, 7 years, which the IRS may consider to be the useful life of that computer, even though you might throw it out after 2 or 3 years. That makes it really onerous for businesses to do their taxes. Full expensing would say you bought a computer, you can write off that whole computer in that 1 year, then you don't need to keep track of it anymore. That'll be great simplification, especially for small business owners.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have today. Thank you so much for sharing your insight on this issue. It's obviously huge right now. I know President Trump has been tweeting about it even this morning, so who knows what he said since we started this interview. So thank you so much. We appreciate all the research you guys do at the Heritage Foundation. And everyone that's watching, be sure to join us next month for our next Facebook Live interview. Thanks so much.